Perfect. Yeah, so again, my name is Andrew LeBoeuf. I'm in the Office of Generic Drug Policy. And throughout yesterday and the beginning of today, you probably heard of different types of complex products, those that have complex formulations, complex dosage forms. We're going to focus on a different one, a type of complex product in the generic world, which really focuses on those drug-device combination products, those that have both a drug constituent as well as a device constituent. So we'll jump into the disclaimer, which many of you I think are very familiar with. You've seen that probably many times, so I won't go through it again. So there's going to be several different focuses that we're going to have during the discussion today. The first one is what I like actually to call Combination Products 101. So what are they? What are the types of different combination products? How do we assign center review for each combination product? Next, we're going to do a brief overview of the general regulatory and policy considerations for those drug-device combination products that are submitted in an NDA. Every combination product is unique in its own respect when it comes down to generics. Notwithstanding, there are general principles that we could derive based on this overall product type that we could share with you. For instance, what are the potential considerations that we have when we consider sameness for a drug-device combination product? We will also go over a brief discussion of our historical policy considerations, policy statements that we've made on this area. Our discussion will then transition over to one of my colleagues, Dr. Kimberly Witzmann, who will then go into, from our Office of Research and Standards, who will then go into a discussion of a recent draft guidance that was issued back in January of 2017, which discusses the user interface considerations for these products. So what is basic device design? How do we assess it in the context of the RLD, and what do we look at for sameness in that respect? We'll then close out the discussion with a brief overview of product-specific or product development considerations for OINDPs, which are oral inhalation and nasal drug products. So what is a combination product? A product comprised of two or more different types of medical products, a drug and device, a drug and biological product, a device and biological product, or actually it could be all three together. They are a distinct type of product because they are made up of different types of medical products. They are not just a drug, they are not just a biologic, and they are not just a device. As such, they're subject to multiple different sets of regulatory authorities. And what I'm referring to in that particular statement is specifically the authorities that are in 21 CFR Part 4, which discuss the good manufacturing practice requirements, as well as those requirements that are associated with post-market safety reporting. Combination products are also assigned to a lead center, which facilitates an effective collaboration and coordination of the review of these particular applications. This is especially important because combination products, especially in the generic space, often raise unique and complex questions. So let's go over the different types of combination products that exist. The first one is a single entity combination product, and that's those products that are chemically or physically combined, where the two constituent parts are chemically or physically combined. Some examples include a drug-eluting stent, a pre-filled syringe, a transdermal patch, bone void fillers with drugs. The second type is a co-packaged product, which is where they're actually co-packaged together for concurrent distribution. They have the same label for concurrent distribution. This includes a first aid or surgical kit, a syringe package with a vial of drug, a drug plus pre-filled diluent. And each of these examples include the relevant regulatory citation. There is a third type of combination product that does exist as well, which is a little less known, but it is a cross-labeled combination product, which is when the constituent parts are packaged separately, so they're not actually distributed together, but are specifically labeled, have bilateral labeling, for use with one another to achieve the intended therapeutic effect. So what is not a combination product? A product comprised of only two or more of the same type of medical product. So if it's drug and drug, it would not be considered a Part 3 combination product. Or for example, a medical product that is combined for use with a non-medical product. So for instance, a drug product that is co-packaged with a food product. Examples could exist where the drugs are combined for only use with each other, such as a fixed dose combination drug, or kits that are just devices just drugs, or just biological products. Now, this is a very important concept when it comes down to combination products, which relates to the primary mode of action. And as I mentioned before, there's different medical products that could be combined for use to actually form a combination product. Let's go over those examples again. It could be a drug and device, it could be a drug and biologic, it could also be a device and biologic, or it could be all three together. And that being said, there could be three potential primary modes of action associated with that product: the drug, the device, or the biological product. And so a combination product is signed for review based on the primary mode of action for that product. And let's define what that term actually means. It's the constituent part that provides the greatest contribution to the product's intended effects. And based on that, center review and assignment will take place. However, that doesn't mean that center reviews it in a silo. We often collaborate and coordinate with the non-lead constituent center to review the product for approval. So now we're going to go over specific considerations for those combination products that are submitted into an ANDA. Many of these concepts are going to be fairly familiar to you, but I'd like to note that at least this is just a broad overview of the regulatory considerations that are associated with these products. Excuse me. For product-specific considerations, I strongly encourage you to obviously refer to agency guidance on a particular topic, or more specifically in the context of the generic program, a product-specific guidance if it has been issued for that particular RLD. So the general framework for ANDAs begins with the listed drug. And that begins with the listed drug, which is an innovator product or brand name product that is approved under Section 505C of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And does rely on the FDA's finding that that innovator drug was safe and effective for its intended uses, or its labeled uses. To be an ANDA, you must demonstrate certain elements of sameness in order to rely on those previous findings, which include a number of different characteristics and additional information. In the context of combination products, the jumping off point really begins with the presentation of the product. So for instance, if the RLD is approved as an auto-injector, we generally require that the generic product also be an auto-injector. If the RLD is a transdermal system, similarly, the generic should come in as a transdermal system. This gives a broad comparison of the two different drug pathways that exist over in CDER, the NDA requirements as well as the ANDA requirements. For the purposes of today's discussion, we're only going to focus on those ANDA requirements. So let's go over those. The proposed generic must have the same active ingredient as its listed drug. It must have the same strength, use indications, dosage form, and route of administration as the listed drug. It must be bioequivalent. It must comply with the same strict standards of manufacturing, quality, and chemistry as its listed drug. And it must also have the same labeling as its listed drug. There are certain exceptions to that rule, and we'll go over that really quick. One example is when there are differences required because of differences that were approved pursuant to a suitability petition. The second exception to the same labeling requirement is what we like to refer to as the differences due to different manufacturers. The third could also be a difference required because there are certain aspects of the labeling or a use indication that is protected by exclusivity or patent. These fundamental aspects of the generic approval pathway or the ANDA approval pathway form the basic definitions that are key terms for us in terms of defining what we like to call therapeutic equivalence. So we'll start with pharmaceutically equivalence. Same active ingredient, dosage form, strength, route of administration, very much things that I had just covered on the previous slide. The generic must also be bioequivalent. Now we're talking about therapeutic equivalence, which is the pillar of generic drug substitutability. So it's approved drug products that are pharmaceutical equivalents for which bioequivalence has been demonstrated, and that can be expected to produce the same clinical effect and safety profile when administered to patients under the conditions specified in the labeling. These key concepts apply to all generic products, including drug-device combination products. So, specifically, a generic drug-device combination product classified as therapeutically equivalent can be expected to produce the same clinical effect and safety profile as its RLD. We're going to go over some of the historical policy statements that we made on drug-device combination products as well, which were initially articulated in 2 different citizen petitions that date back almost about 10 years ago. The first one is the King petition, which was a general petition initially on auto-injector design, performance discussions, and then it did morph into a discussion also on a sumatriptan auto-injector. The second citizen petition is the Day petition, which focused on emergency use products, and more specifically, these sameness considerations for an epinephrine auto-injector product. These petitions gave us insight on a few different really important key characteristics or key review considerations. How do we look at sameness of device design? How we looked at sameness of device performance? How we looked at use-related considerations and instructions for use? These early principles that were articulated in the citizen petitions, combined with our increased knowledge of these products, form the policies that we have today. So for instance, when we talk about performance characteristics, the review of the generic combination product is informed by the general framework of ANDAs, which I had talked about a few slides back. But it also takes into consideration the performance of the device constituent and its interaction and impact on the delivery of the drug constituent as well. We also talk about user interface considerations or use-related considerations. And that's where we give rise to this draft guidance, which was issued back in January of 2017, which is entitled Comparative Analyses and Related Comparative Use Human Factor Studies for a Drug-Device Combination Product submitted in an ANDA. Now, I won't go into the specific aspects of the guidance. I'm going to defer to Dr. Witzmann for that particular discussion, but I am going to focus on some of the key takeaways that we tried to instill in this particular guidance. So we'll go over those right now. FDA does not expect that the design of the user interface or everything that the user interacts with when they're using that particular product to be identical to the design of the user interface for its RLD. Differences in design of the user interface should be adequately analyzed, scientifically justified, and otherwise not preclude approval under an ANDA. We intend to assess whether an end user can use the generic combination product when it is substituted for the RLD without the intervention of a healthcare provider and or without the additional training prior to use of the generic combination product. Now on to the labeling discussion. Certain labeling differences to reflect the differences in design between the generic combination product and its RLD may be permitted and will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. This provides a baseline, the comparative analyses that are articulated in this guidance provide a baseline assessment of these differences. How can you identify them? How do you assess them in the context of an ANDA? And it will help you determine, or at least give an initial cut as to whether additional information or data would be warranted to help support your application. And in that respect, the guidance does go into certain recommendations on what we call comparative use human factor studies. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Witzmann for further discussion.
Okay, good morning and thank you. Mr. LeBoeuf has just spent the last 14 minutes speaking very quickly about the regulatory implications for this. So I'm going to take the information regarding user interface and put it hopefully into a little bit more of a user-friendly or a nuts and bolts kind of approach as to what we want to be thinking about when we're looking at these drug-device combination products for generic development. So the first things that I want to say before I get started into that is that for this portion of the discussion, I am talking about the user interface and that distinction of sameness for these products. So, and how that sameness goes into that finding of therapeutic equivalence that you just heard about, which is essentially that there's the same clinical effect and safety profile of the test product to the RLD when it's administered to patients under the conditions specified in the labeling. And for clarity again, I'm not talking about the quality considerations for the device itself. I'm not talking about the engineering specifications for the device itself. And I'm not talking about formative or validated human factor studies for these either. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about is just a few definitions. So the first definition I wanted to bring up is the external critical design attributes. So these refer to features that directly affect how users perform a critical task necessary in order to use or administer the drug product. Oops. And I need to go back to the user interface definition, which is referring to all components of a product with which a user interacts, including labels and packaging, the delivery device constituent part, and any associated controls or displays. So now I put up this slide merely as an example. These are just some arbitrarily chosen devices, just to show you sort of the scope of complexity with only one subgroup of drug device combination products. So these are orally inhaled products. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a standard metered dose inhaler. The one above it is a soft mist inhaler. The majority of the other products on the slides are all the different varieties of dry powder inhalation devices, which include those with a single reservoir for the drug powder, those that come with the drug powder in capsules, those that contain them within blister strips for multi-doses. So there can be a wide variety of these different presentations that are available. And we had to have a framework that appreciates and understands those differences between them, as well as recognizes some of the similarities. So within the comparative analyses that are described in the guidance, there are three key features that we ask people to look at within the comparative analyses. The first is the labeling comparison. The second is a comparative task analysis. And the third is the physical comparison of the delivery device constituent part. So my next slides are going to talk about each of these in order. So the first, for the labeling comparison. What we mean when we refer to labeling comparison is just simply a side-by-side, line-by-line comparison of the full prescribing information, the instructions for use, and descriptions of both the delivery device constituent parts of the generic combination product as compared to its RLD. So as an example, again, arbitrarily chosen, there's no significant meaning in anything that was chosen here, except that this one had a nice breakdown of being able to cut the pictures and the words and stick them into the box. So what we expect to see for a labeling comparison when you submit that to us to take a look at it would be on the left-hand side is the RLD products labeling, and on the right-hand side is where you would put your proposed labeling for your proposed generic product. Again, you would want to keep in mind not just the language that's in there, but also the figures that are in there. You would want to see that if the RLD labeling has a number of figures which label all the parts of their device, then you would probably want to include something very similar to that, labeling the parts of your device. Same if it shows a picture with a patient using the device or with an arrow to point to which direction the arrow was going, you would probably want to use something very similar in yours as well. So the next analysis that we talk about is the comparative task analysis. And this is where we actually compare between the RLD and the proposed generic drug device combination product. And again, we're looking at these critical tasks. And critical tasks are those user tasks that, if they're performed incorrectly or not performed at all, could cause harm to the patient or the user. And harm is defined as anything from actual injury to death all the way up to not getting your dose of drug. So harm has a very large definition in this case. And so we want to focus on those tasks that are really important to make sure the drug does what it's supposed to, gets to where it's supposed to go, and is used the same. With regard to the physical comparison of the delivery device, this is, again, just a side-by-side explanation of the visual and tactile examination of the features of the RLD product, and then comparing those to the delivery device constituent part for the proposed generic product. Now, I do have just visual and tactile on this slide, but that's just because I was running out of room for words. So it would also include things, for example, if there's an auditory cue if the reference listed product makes a whistle sound when you use it, or if there's a buzzer or a click or a whirring sound that people use to cue to say, oh, I'm getting my medicine or I'm doing this right. Those things would all need to be taken into consideration for this physical comparison of the delivery device constituent part. It would also include things like shape and size of the product. So for example, if you were planning to make a metered dose inhaler, most people are familiar with those, the little L-shaped actuators. If you had a metered dose inhaler and you wanted to make yours and it matched exactly, except that it was twice as big as the RLD product for whatever reason, twice as tall, that probably would be something that you would pick up significantly when you're doing this comparison. And it might have significant meaning because, for example, patients might not be able to get their hands all the way up to the top to actuate that canister. So those are the kind of things that we want you to be thinking of and looking at when you're doing the side-by-side comparison of the test, the proposed test product to the reference listed drug product. So now that you've done those three analyses, we come to the part where what does it all mean? How do we put this together? So when we assess these, there are basically, we want to assess them in terms of any identified differences between the proposed generic product and its RLD in the context of the overall risk profile for the product. So there's three ways that this can kind of fall out. One is that there are absolutely no differences. So for example, that may be a case where the RLD product had their device and now they've decided for whatever reason that they're going to market their device for use by generic firms to be able to use the same exact device. I can't think of a specific example where that's ever happened, but it could. So that would be an example where there would be no differences in the device at all. A second case would be if there are minor differences in the device. And the guidance actually describes the difference as minor if the differences in the user interface for the proposed generic combination problem in comparison to the RLD do not affect one of those external critical design attributes. So an example of that may be the RLD device is blue and the test product is a seafoam green. So something that may not make a big difference for the actual users to be able to use that. Now, I did pick color because it's a straightforward one, but I do want to have you keep in mind it may not be as straightforward as that. For example, if you have an actuator button on something that's bright red because this is where the button really, really has to be pushed for an emergency use, for example, if you change the color of that button, that same color issue could be considered now to be a critical design attribute. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking of things like color. Again, size, shape, if it's a complete square versus if the corners are a little rounded off, things like that that may be not affecting those external critical design attributes are what we're talking about with those minor differences. So the last category then is other, and that's basically everything that's not no different and not minor difference. And so FDA may not view a difference as minor if any aspect of those threshold analyses that you've submitted suggests differences in design of that user interface of the proposed generic combination product as compared to that RLD may impact that external critical design attribute that would involve administration of the product. So if we're not sure if it might impact the administration or if it looks like it really does impact the administration, that falls into this other differences bucket. So in instances where we get that other than minor difference that's identified, we usually have some standard advice. And our first advice to sponsors or to applicants is we really want you to consider whether that user interface might need to be redesigned or not. Was there a specific reason that you chose these, and are you willing to continue on knowing that there may be additional things, or is this a relatively straightforward thing where you can say, oh, we thought it would be good, but we might be able to change that back so that it's not so different, and it wouldn't take up a lot more time, energy, financial resources, or things like that. So one of our first comments back is to really consider whether or not that's a possibility. The second thing would be that at that point, if you're still in that other than minor bucket, is what's the potential need for additional information and or data to help support your ANDA submission. So additional information and data can be can be of varying types, and it would basically be on a case-by-case basis. So at that point, our recommendation is if you feel that you have this bucket, or if you're close to this bucket, that we want you to come and talk with us. We would invite you to come to a pre-ANDA meeting to create a meeting package and submit that to us. And we will discuss with you where we think you are and how and what paths forward might be for your specific issue. Because of course, everybody's issue is going to be different. Even for two companies creating a generic to the same product, you may have different issues, even though you're both going for the same reference listed drug product. So the second, then our guidance in the appendix gives an example of a comparative use human factor study. And so the one thing that I wanted to really stress to people here today is that if you think that you're at this point and you think you may need additional data or information to support your ANDA submission, if you think that you want to use a comparative use human factor study as described in the appendix, we would really recommend you come and talk to us so that we can work out those details and make sure that what we don't want to have you do is for you to go and do it and then us to say, well, no, that's not what we meant. So we want to make sure that we have that dialogue and discussion so that you're doing things once, we're being able to help you and work through and navigate that challenging aspect of the application. Okay. So I want to take a moment here before I move on to the next part to talk a little bit more specifically about orally inhaled and nasal drug products. And I just want to say again, when you're looking at your comparative analyses for your drug device combination product, I wanted to make sure that I took a moment to state that it's really important as you go through your design for your program and your development of your product to make sure that you understand that you can reach out to FDA. We will, under a controlled correspondence, we will take a look at your proposed product design user interface as well as your comparative analyses. And we will do what we call a device assessment, again, looking at that user interface. We will not talk about the internal mechanisms of your device or any of the OPQ or CDRH issues, but to look at that user interface. And we will do that under a control correspondence, which has a 60-day clock. So you can submit it, and we will be able to get you some feedback. Now, the other thing about this is that ideally, this should be an iterative process. So if you have an idea and you want to know, and say you're thinking about something and you're not sure, you're thinking it might be a little too far out and you're not sure if it would actually be eligible for an ANDA or not, you could submit that early design to us with those prototypes that Ms. Andre talked about in her talk yesterday. And you can submit that to us, and we will go through and give you our thoughts specific to your product. So you can receive feedback that way. And then looking at it and taking that feedback back, working through your product design and development a little bit more, when you get to the next phase, you can submit again, and then we can make more comments. And so it can be an iterative process. It does not have to be a one-shot deal only after you've finished doing everything. And that's actually what we hope you don't do, because we want to help to work through some of these more tricky issues with some of these device combination products. So now, having said that, moving on to just the orally inhaled and nasal drug products as an example. Again, reminding that these are complex products specifically. They are complex not only because they have complex routes of delivery, they're locally acting drugs, they also have the complex drug-device combination product aspect of them, including the nasal spray, metered-dose inhalers, dry powder inhalers, soft mist inhalers. But they also have complexity or uncertainty concerning the approval pathway or possible alternative approach. So any of these could benefit from early scientific engagement. And in that case, we also, if you have other questions in addition to your device design or larger questions about your development program, this is when a pre-ANDA meeting request could be really helpful to you. So just specifically, again, for the orally inhaled and nasal drug products, there are a lot of things that we take into consideration when we're looking at a generic product and its relevance to the RLD product. We can look at energy source. Is it an active source or is it passive? What's the presentation for the system? Is this a dry powder inhaler with individual capsules that have to be loaded into a device, or is this a metered dose inhaler? So those are some of the things that we have to consider. We look at the dose metering principle. Is it, how is the dose metered for the device? What's the appearance of the device? How big is it? How tall is it? How do you hold it? Where are the hand grips? How do you get your hands around it when you're about to utilize it? What are the external operating principles behind the device? What are the cleaning instructions for the device? And how do those, and again, how each of these then relate back to the RLD product. So what's the functionality, the accuracy, and the robustness of the device? How does the dose counting mechanism, if one is there, work? What is the resistance for the device? For example, if it's a dry powder inhaler, what's the inhalation resistance profile for it? And then finally, when we look at these drugs that are delivered to the respiratory system, there are a lot of things that influence that patient-product interaction and the bioavailability for these drugs. And so things that are maybe not the most intuitive right away can actually still impact the drug delivery and the overall therapeutic equivalence for these products. So for example, the percent of dose that's deposited in the lungs versus the dose percent that gets swallowed or absorbed from the GI tract based on how big the particle size, which can be determined upon the specific device constituent parts, like the pump, what size particles come out when you push the pump or actuate the pump. There's local solubility and permeability considerations, receptor affinity issues, the deposition of the product in central versus peripheral parts of the respiratory tract. Pulmonary residence time can play a role. Local clearance of the product, the device design that we've talked about, and then also effects of formulation differences on product performance. So there are a lot of considerations that we know that come into play with these complex drug-device combination products. And the take-home message for this, hopefully, is that for these products, because there are so many moving parts, pardon the term, timing of when you consider these, how you work through these issues within your development program, really timing is really critical. Timing is everything. So we know that the device design impacts the critical parameters for your drug delivery. And so we also say that the in vivo bioequivalence studies should be conducted with the to-be-marketed device. So if you go through and you do your development program, and then at the very end of your development program, after you've gotten through all these steps, you submit your device, and your device may not be substitutable for the reference product, that would probably be something that would not be very good. So that's why we say timing. You need to be thinking about these things in advance and try to figure out how to put the pieces together that's going to work best for your design program. So user interface, again, should be considered early and throughout development. And if a device is redesigned late in product development to address a substitutability issue, it really may affect it could even affect your in vitro characterizations, depending on what the issue is or what the problem might be. And again, in those situations, sometimes we're put in a position where now we may have to ask for additional bridging data because now you've changed your to-be-marketed device after you've already done your bioequivalence studies, and now sometime we have to make a bridge back from one set of studies to the current device, the current product that you want to market. So all of these things can come into play, and hopefully I've given you a little better understanding of that today. And so to conclude, hopefully between Mr. LeBoeuf and I, we have given you an example that these products in specific have a number of complex regulatory and scientific challenges, that device design can impact in vitro and in vivo performance and delivery of drug to the site of action, that the user interface design should be considered throughout the generic complex drug product development program, that comparative analyses are used to evaluate potential differences in the user interface of a test product against its reference listed drug, that the assessment of therapeutic equivalence includes multiple considerations, and that there are multiple opportunities for frequent communications with FDA throughout a product's pre-ANDA life so that we can help to work through these things before your ANDA is ready to come in. And thank you very much.
Thank you.